Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is Dewey Defeats Truman? Stop the presses. The year is 1948. It is a presidential election year, and if we go back to the 19th century, 4 vice presidents had been elevated to the presidency during their term, and none of them got their own term as president. In fact, none of those 4 were even nominated by their party for their own term as president. But in the 20th century, that seemed to be changing. You've got Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, both elevated from the vice presidency into the top spot, and both were not only nominated for their own terms, they both won their own terms as president. So which trend would it be for Harry Truman here in 1948? Well, he certainly had a record to run on. He had been president for most of Franklin Roosevelt's 4th term since Roosevelt had died so early in that term. He had overseen the end of World War II. He had stood up to Joseph Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. The economy, post-war economy, is usually not very good in the United States. In this case, it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad either. Unemployment was still pretty low. Yes, there was some labor strife, but Truman had kind of helped work through that a little bit. And again, importantly, on the international scene, he continued to stand up to Soviet aggression. Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, all of these elements, as well as his recent civil rights pledges, which again were controversial in parts of the country, but he certainly had a record to run on. The bigger problem for Harry Truman was he just didn't seem to be very popular. He maybe paled in comparison still, with Franklin Roosevelt still hanging over his shoulder, with an approval rating of only 36% in April of 1948, just a couple of months before the conventions. And part of the Roosevelt group, James Roosevelt, his oldest son, was one of the ones who were saying, you know what, maybe we should look in a different direction for a different nominee. James Roosevelt was pushing to bring Dwight Eisenhower, the World War II hero and general, into the mix as the candidate for the Democrats. He thought if he would run, he was very popular, that the Democrats would certainly hold the White House. Now, Eisenhower had not said whether or not he's a Republican or a Democrat, didn't talk about being interested in the race at this point, but there was this push, and Harry Truman wasn't very happy about it. Truman went to California, James Roosevelt's home state, to accept an honorary degree at the University of California in Berkeley, and he confronted James Roosevelt. He told him, your father asked me to take this job, I didn't want it. I was happy in the Senate, but your father asked me to take it and I took it. If your father knew what you're doing to me, he would turn over in his grave. But get this straight, whether you like it or not, I am going to be the next president of the United States. That will be all. Good day. Harry Truman clearly committed to making this run. And as for Eisenhower, well, shortly before the conventions, he basically took himself out of everything. He still hadn't declared his party affiliation, but he says he's not running in 48. So the Republicans went back to Tom Dewey, the New York governor that Roosevelt had defeated in 1944. He was nominated for a second chance at the presidency. The Democrats then gathered in Philadelphia at the convention hall for their convention, and Alben Barkley, the Senate Majority Leader and the chairman of this convention, gave the keynote address, a pretty rousing address, and then they finally got to the votes. The votes, well, Harry Truman nominated and got the nomination. It wasn't unanimous. It wasn't clear right away, but he got the nomination. It just took a while with a lot of speeches. It was 1:45 in the morning by the time he got a chance to accept in person his nomination. But it may have been a sleepy hall at that point, but Harry Truman woke him up. He gave, again, an aggressive, rousing speech accepting the Democratic nomination there in 1948. Senator Barkley and I will win this election and make the Republicans like it. Don't you forget it, he told the delegates. We will do that because they are wrong and we are right. And then Truman did something a little bit surprising to folks. He announced at the convention he was calling Congress back into special session to try to move forward some of his legislative agenda that had basically been thwarted by the Republicans who were leading Congress at the time. In his address, Truman said, I'm going to call Congress back and ask them to pass laws to halt rising prices, to meet the housing crisis, which they say are for in their platform. I shall ask them to act upon aid to education, which they say are for, and civil rights legislation, which they say they are for. He was really putting the Republicans in Congress on notice in kind of a no-lose situation for Truman, because either they pass his legislation, which would be good for him, or they do nothing, sit on their hands, and that actually is what happened. The Republicans did nothing, which played into his main campaign theme. Harry Truman was going to run against the do-nothing Republican 80th Congress, and basically telling the American people, you want to get stuff done, done, you got to send me back along with Democrats to Washington, D.C. Well, Truman did the next 3 months of this campaign mostly on a railroad train. His whistle-stop tour across the country, giving speeches back of that train multiple times a day. The big speeches would be in auditoriums in some of the larger cities. Now, Truman had not always been an effective orator. He had that Missouri twang, which was a little off-putting to some folks. He tended to look down and read his speeches and rush through them, but this was a different Harry Truman during this whistle-stop tour. Much more extemporaneous, really talking in a very plain talk, highly effective, and Truman talked about the importance of this. You've got to know how to talk to people. That's the whole thing. And you've got to convince them that you know what you're talking about. They don't go for hi-hats. They can spot a phony a mile off. The crowds for Harry Truman were pretty enthusiastic. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Seattle, Truman talked about some bird way up in the balcony shouted, "Give him hell, Harry." Well, that became basically the campaign theme. Harry Truman was going to give him hell against the do-nothing Republican Congress. That was setting up to be the big contrast. Truman then had, again, a variety of these events. He was very much of a natural at the National Mowing Contest in Dexter, Iowa. This was with the farmers, his people. He spoke their language. About 90,000 folks showed up, and Truman told them the Democratic Party puts human rights and human welfare first. They, the Republicans, are cunning men. They want a return of the Wall Street economic dictatorship. These Republican gluttons of privilege are cold men. Truman also sort of made up with labor. Kind of a difficult situation for Truman in the first part of his first term in office, but he vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, which was seemed to be very much anti-labor. Now, Congress, that do-nothing Congress, actually overrode his veto. So for labor, you've got a very clear contrast and labor very much coming back into the Democratic camp, and Truman was pushing that pretty hard. Truman also did not ignore the small towns. He realized this was going to be a close election, especially in swing states. He needed to make contact with as many people as possible. In particular, for example, in the state of Ohio. Tom Dewey had beaten Franklin Roosevelt in Ohio in 1944 in a very close race. This could be a decisive state in 1948. Truman on his train went to every county in Ohio, stopping in the back of that train for speeches in small groups, large groups, whatever it was. He wanted to touch everybody in that state. In Willard, Ohio, just a tiny community, he said the Republican candidate and Republican Congress do not trust the people. They just work along at their old problem of trying to fool the people into voting for the interests of the few. Again, using plain language to try to make that connection. Now, despite all of this, most of the pundits thought Harry Truman had no chance. Again, his favorability rating was low. It had been 16 years of the Democrats. Typically, you're going to go for some kind of change. Dewey was a very solid opponent. On the whistle-stop tour, Truman feels like he's gaining momentum, but again, most of the political pundits a couple of months out, not giving him much of a chance at all. Now, this was not a two-man race between Truman and Dewey. It was a four-man race. At the Democratic Convention, some of the Southern Democrats actually walked out of the convention and walked out of the party because of Truman's stance on civil rights. They created their own party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, most commonly known as the Dixiecrats, and they nominated a senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, to be their standard bearer. Now, civil rights would not be a major platform element for Harry Truman in his stump speeches and in the campaign, but he didn't back down from the topic either. Some things of note: in Texas, he gave a rally to an unsegregated crowd, which has sort of been unheard of in that state previously. He also was in a parade and gave a speech in Harlem in New York City, many people believe to be sort of the unofficial capital of the black community in America. He put the South in play because some were going to maybe peel off and go away from him, but it was an important position for Truman. He thought it might help him politically in some places. He also just thought it was the right thing to do, and that typically was what drove Harry Truman. He wasn't backing away from the topic. So now you've got Truman, Dewey, Thurmond, and Henry Wallace. The former vice president was also running. Now, he was running to the far left of everybody, the progressive citizens of America. He was almost communistic in his approach, favoring a much greater relationship with Russia. Others were very nervous about this kind of approach. He did have some rabid followers, not a lot, but he could be an important element to sway the election in a couple of key states, certainly something to keep an eye on. What about Dewey? Well, Dewey played it safe. He said little, and when he did talk, it was kind of political pablum. It was nothing controversial, but it was also nothing inspirational. He appeared stiff and calculating. He tried to come across as a statesman, but kind of falling flat compared to the everyman Harry Truman, who was out there connecting with the people. And then sometimes just little incidents really can make a difference, and Tom Dewey had one of those. He was going to make a speech from the back of his train. He was in Illinois when the train suddenly lurched backward for just a moment, and his response, an angry response, was caught on the microphone for everyone to hear. Dewey said, "That's the first lunatic I've had for an engineer. He probably ought to be shot at sunrise." Well, that statement was carried across the entire country in newspapers, and it did not play well. Still, the pundits continued. About a month before the election were almost unanimous that Dewey was going to win this race. Truman had no chance. Newsweek, the magazine, did a poll. 50 political reporters and experts were polled, and the result, 50-0. Tom Dewey was being predicted to be the next president of the United States. 50-0. Harry Truman wasn't bothered by this. He said, "Look, I know every one of those 50 fellows. There isn't one of them has enough sense to pound sand in a rat hole." He was still positive, optimistic. In fact, he was indefatigable, more than almost anybody on his staff. Up early in the morning, dozens of speeches sort of every day, back of the train, auditoriums. He would go until midnight. He would set up and do it again and again, day after day. His staff was exhausted. They were more realistic, but Truman was convinced he was making a connection with the American people, and they were going to send him back to Washington, D.C. Well, for the vote itself on Election Day, Truman went back to Independence, Missouri with his family, like he typically did for Election Day. He cast his ballot, and then he kind of went off by himself. He went to a hotel, and he took a long nap. He was going to get away from the noise, let the election kind of play out, and wait for those results. Now, periodically, he would get sort of updates as to what was going on. He lost New York, which was sort of a big one, and this is the one state where Henry Wallace probably pulled enough votes away from Truman to give that state to Dewey. Strom Thurmond won 4 states in the South as a third-party candidate and picked up 39 electoral votes in the process, but the rest of the South, including Texas, all stayed with Truman in the typical Democratic stronghold. But this race really came down to 3 close states: Illinois, California, and Ohio. Around 4 a.m., it was Illinois that was called for Truman. Still waiting to see what's going to happen with California and Ohio hanging in the balance. Now, Truman finally got up about 6 o'clock in the morning. He went over to the Mulebach Hotel in Kansas City, where all his supporters were there. They were exhausted. He was completely refreshed, and then they got the good news. At 8:30, it was called for California. At 9:30, it was called for, or rather Ohio. At 9:30, it was called for California. Both of those states went for Truman by less than 1/2% of the vote, but it was enough to put him over the top. Electoral College for Harry Truman, 303 to 189 over Dewey. Again, Thurmond also had 39 votes in the Electoral College. Henry Wallace had 0. Popular vote, 24 million for Truman, 22 million for Dewey. So how did this happen? How did the pundits get it all wrong? Well, it is likely the greatest upset in presidential history, based on what everybody was expecting, that Harry Truman was going to go down and go down big. Truman felt it was the labor vote that made the difference. Dewey thought it was the farmers that made the difference. Some people thought it was the black community that Truman got to support him, particularly in swing states like Ohio, could have been the difference. A lot of Republicans thought the difference was the fact that Dewey was a lousy candidate. He just didn't do a very good job and frankly hurt himself on the stump. I think one of the most interesting comments came from Clark Clifford, counsel to the president, who said this about Truman and why he won. "It wasn't, in my opinion, because he was a skilled politician that he won. He was a good politician, a sensible politician, but that wasn't why he was elected president. It was the remarkable courage in the man, his refusal to be discouraged, his willingness to go through the suffering of that campaign, the fatigue, the will to fight every step of the way, the will to win. It wasn't Harry Truman the politician who won, it was Harry Truman the man." And Truman had an opportunity to sort of relish this. He, on the next day, heading back with his family on the train to Washington, D.C., they did a stop in St. Louis, where he picked up the morning newspaper, the Chicago Daily Tribune. And Truman looked at this and sort of relished this headline for the rest of his career on how all the experts got it wrong. You can kind of look at that smile, his pride and joy, all sort of captured in that one moment. Look, there were a lot of emotions going through Harry Truman's mind as he was elected there in 1948. The bottom line, though, he did it. He did the surprise, he won the election, he got his own term as President of the United States. That is Harry Truman, and Dewey Defeats Truman. Stop the presses. From the life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.